The dining room glowed under the soft chandelier light, a warm haze settling over the polished oak table where my friends sat, their laughter spilling like the wine I'd poured too generously tonight. I leaned back in my chair, the stem of my glass cool against my fingers, and watched Tom fidget with his napkin across from me. He'd been quiet all evening, his jaw tight, his eyes darting to the clock like he couldn't wait to escape. It irritated me, his stiffness, his inability to just relax and play along. My friends, Lisa and Karen, were recounting some ridiculous story about a coworker, their voices bright and teasing, and I caught Mark's gaze from the end of the table. His lips twitched, that familiar spark in his eyes, and I felt a thrill coil in my chest. Tom cleared his throat then, interrupting Lisa mid-sentence with some awkward comment about the roast being overcooked. It was petty, pointless, and I felt the heat rise in my face. "Seriously, Tom?" I snapped, louder than I meant to. The room stilled, forks hovering, eyes flicking toward me. He blinked, startled, and I saw my chance. I lifted my glass, the red wine sloshing slightly, and flung it at him. It splashed across his face, dripping down his shirt, staining the crisp white fabric he'd ironed so meticulously. "Why are you always acting like such an idiot?" I said, letting a laugh bubble up, sharp and deliberate. The table erupted, Lisa's gasp, Karen's stifled giggle, and I leaned into it, playing the queen of the moment. Tom's face burned red, but he didn't shout. He just wiped his cheek with a napkin, stood, and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. I stayed, refilling my glass, basking in the chatter that picked up again. "He'll get over it," I said to Lisa, waving a hand. "He's so dramatic sometimes." Mark caught my eye again, his foot brushing mine under the table, and I smiled into my drink. The night stretched on, the wine flowing, the air thick with secrets I'd tucked neatly behind my laughter. By the time I left, my head buzzed, my heels clicking unevenly on the pavement as I waved goodbye to the girls, and Mark lingered just a second too long by my car, his hand grazing my arm. The house was dark when I got home, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. I kicked off my shoes, humming to myself, still riding the high of the evening. Tom always sulked after a fight. He'd be in bed, probably, or brooding in his office. I flipped on the kitchen light, and there he was, sitting at the table, still as stone. My phone sat in front of him, the screen awake, glowing like a beacon. My stomach lurched, but I forced a smile, tossing my purse onto the counter. "What's with the face?" I teased, stepping closer. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me with those cold, steady eyes. I glanced at the phone, and my breath caught Mark's name, a string of messages, words I'd never meant for Tom to see. "What are you doing with that?" I demanded, my voice sharper now, but he just sat there, silent, and I felt the ground tilt beneath me. The kitchen felt smaller with Tom sitting there, his hands flat on the table, my phone glowing like some kind of accusation between us. I forced my lips into a curve, a casual tilt of my head, and stepped toward him, the linoleum cool under my bare feet. "What's this, Tom? Playing detective now?" I kept my tone light, teasing like I could brush this off as one of his moody overreactions. He didn't answer, just stared at me, his eyes dark and unblinking, and that silence, it sliced through me sharper than any words could have. I reached for the phone, quick and smooth, but his hand shot out, pinning it to the table. My heart stuttered, but I laughed, sharp and short. "Oh, come on. Don't be ridiculous." He finally spoke then, his voice low, steady, like he'd rehearsed it. "How long, Cheryl?" I froze, my fingers hovering over his wrist, and for a second I thought about playing dumb, wide eyes, a pout, the whole act. But the way he looked at me, like he'd already seen through every lie I'd ever told, made my throat tighten. "How long what?" I shot back, pulling my hand away, crossing my arms. "You're blowing this out of proportion. It's just Mark. You know him. He's your friend." I leaned on that word, friend, letting it hang, hoping it'd guilt him into backing off. But Tom didn't flinch. He slid the phone toward me, slow, deliberate, and I caught a glimpse of the screen. "Missed you tonight. Can't wait for tomorrow." My own words, sent hours ago, staring back at me. I swallowed, my mind racing. "That's nothing," I said, waving a hand, stepping back toward the counter. "We were just joking around. You know how we are." I turned, busying myself with my purse, digging for nothing, anything to break his gaze. "You're so paranoid sometimes, Tom. It's exhausting." I heard him stand, the chair scraping against the floor, and I braced myself, expecting him to yell, to demand answers. But he didn't. He just walked past me, his shoulder brushing mine, and disappeared down the hall. The quiet swallowed me again, and I stood there, clutching my bag, my pulse thudding in my ears. I poured myself a glass of water, the tap hissing too loud in the stillness, and tried to shake it off. He'd cool down. He always did. I'd spin this tomorrow, tell him he'd misread it, that Mark was just being Mark, that I'd been drunk and silly. I sipped the water, letting the cold settle me, and then I heard it, a faint rustle from upstairs. My office. My stomach twisted. I set the glass down, slow, and climbed the stairs, my bare feet silent on the carpet. The door to my office was ajar, a sliver of light spilling out, and I pushed it open. Tom stood there, my laptop open on the desk, his back to me. "What are you doing?" I snapped, my voice cracking despite myself. He didn't turn, just kept scrolling, and I saw the email tab open. Mark's name again, a thread I'd buried months ago. "Tom, stop it," I said, stepping forward, my hands trembling now. "You're invading my privacy." He laughed then, a hollow, bitter sound that made me flinch. "Privacy?" he muttered, and finally faced me, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. "You don't get to talk about privacy, Cheryl." He clicked something and a photo loaded, a blurry shot of me and Mark, his arm around my waist, taken at that bar last month when I told Tom I was with Lisa. My mouth went dry, and I lunged for the laptop, but he pulled it away, staring at me like I was a stranger. "Get out," he said, quiet but firm, and I froze, the air thick with something I couldn't name, fear, maybe, or the start of something breaking. The air in my office felt heavy, like it was pressing me into the floor as Tom stood there. The laptop screen casting a pale glow across his face. That photo, me and Mark, tangled in a moment I'd sworn was innocent, burned into the silence between us. I forced my voice steady, tilting my chin up. "You're making a mountain out of nothing, Tom," I said, stepping closer, softening my tone like I could coax him back to me. "That was just a night out. Lisa was there, you can ask her." My lie slid out smooth, practiced, and I reached for his arm, but he jerked away, his jaw clenching so hard I thought it might crack. "Stop it, Cheryl," he said, his voice a low growl now, nothing like the quiet man I'd mocked at dinner. "I already called Lisa. She hasn't seen you in weeks." My stomach dropped, a cold sweat prickling my neck, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't. "She's lying," I shot back, crossing my arms, leaning into the counterattack. "She's always had it out for me, you know that. She's jealous." He shook his head, slow, like he pitied me, and turned the laptop toward me. Another email loaded, Mark's words again. "Last night was worth the risk. Same time next week." My breath hitched, but I forced a laugh, shrill and jagged. "He's joking, Tom. You're taking this way too seriously." He didn't bite. He clicked again, and my own reply popped up. "Can't wait." Tom's clueless. The room spun, my pulse hammering in my throat, and I scrambled for something, anything. "That's not what it looks like," I said, my voice rising. I was venting. "He's my friend too, you know. You're twisting this." Tom's eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer, towering over me in a way that made my chest tighten. "Clueless," he repeated, soft, dangerous. "That's what you think of me." I opened my mouth, but he cut me off, holding up a hand. "Don't. Just don't." He turned away, slamming the laptop shut, and I felt the walls closing in. I followed him as he stormed downstairs, my bare feet slipping on the steps. "Tom, wait, let's talk about this," I called, desperation creeping in despite myself. He grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door and I darted in front of him, blocking the way. "You're overreacting," I said, softer now, reaching for his face. "I'd never hurt you. You know me." He stared down at me, and for a second I thought I had him, those eyes softening, the old Tom flickering back. Then he pushed past me, gentle but firm, and opened the door. "I don't know you at all," he said, and stepped into the night. The door clicked shut, and I stood there, the echo of his words sinking into me like a bruise. My hands shook as I locked the door, my mind racing. He'd come back, he always did. I just needed to figure out how to spin this, how to bury it. I poured another glass of wine, the bottle nearly empty now, and sank onto the couch, replaying the night. The wine in his face, the laughter, Mark's touch under the table, it all felt so distant now, like a game I played too well. My phone buzzed on the counter, and I ignored it, assuming it was Mark, until it buzzed again. And again. I dragged myself over, the screen lighting up with the text from Karen. "Tom just showed up here. He's asking about Mark." "What's going on?" My glass slipped from my hand, shattering on the floor, the red pooling like blood across the tiles. I stared at it, my breath shallow, and realized he wasn't just sulking this time. He was digging, and Karen, sweet, nosy Karen, might just hand him the shovel. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I typed. "Tell him nothing. I'll explain later." But before I could hit send, the doorbell rang, sharp and insistent, and I froze, the sound cutting through the haze like a blade. The doorbell's echo bounced off the walls, a harsh jolt that made my hands clench around my phone. The shattered glass glittered on the floor, the wine seeping into the grout, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they'd fused to the spot. Another ring, louder this time, insistent, and I forced myself forward, my bare feet crunching over the shards. I peered through the peephole, my breath fogging the glass, and saw Mark standing there, his coat collar up, his face tight with something I couldn't read. My stomach flipped, a mix of relief and dread, and I yanked the door open, the cold night air rushing in. "What are you doing here?" I hissed, pulling him inside before the neighbors could peek out. He shook off the damp from his sleeves, his eyes darting around like he expected Tom to lunge from the shadows. "Karen called me," he said, his voice low, urgent. Said Tom showed up at her place, asking questions. "What the hell happened tonight?" I shut the door, leaning against it, my mind spinning. "He saw your messages," I muttered, crossing my arms to hide the tremble in my hands. "And some emails." "He's losing it, Mark." His jaw tightened, and he ran a hand through his hair, pacing the entryway. "You said he'd never check your phone." "I didn't think he would." I snapped, my voice cracking. "He's never cared before, he's too busy moping to notice anything." Mark stopped, turning to me, his eyes narrowing. "Well, he's noticing now." "What did you tell him?" I shrugged, forcing nonchalance even as my chest squeezed. "That it's nothing. That you're just a friend. He's overreacting, like always." Mark's laugh was bitter short. "You threw wine in his face, Cheryl. In front of everyone. You think he's just gonna swallow that?" I glared at him, stepping closer. "Don't lecture me. You were there, egging me on." He held my gaze, then looked away, exhaling hard. "We need to get our story straight." "If he's talking to Karen," I cut him off, grabbing his arm. "She won't say anything." I texted her to keep quiet. He pulled free, shaking his head. "You sure about that?" "She's not exactly your biggest fan." I opened my mouth to argue, but my phone buzzed again, lighting up on the counter. I snatched it, another text from Karen. "He's still here. Asking about that weekend you said you were with me." What do I say? My throat closed and Mark leaned over my shoulder, reading it. "Great," he muttered. "Just great." I typed fast. "Tell him I was with you. Shopping trip. Stick to it." I hit send, my fingers shaking, and turned to Mark. "She'll cover. She owes me." He didn't look convinced, his eyes dark with doubt, but he nodded. "Fine. But we need to lay low. No more calls, no more nights out, not until this blows over." I smirked, despite the knot in my gut. "You're scared of him now?" He didn't smile back. "I'm not scared of him. I'm scared of what he'll do when he knows everything." The words hung there, heavy, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. I brushed it off, pouring myself another glass from the half-empty bottle on the counter, ignoring the mess on the floor. "He won't find out," I said, sipping slow, letting the wine steady me. "I'll talk to him tomorrow, smooth it over. He'll believe me, he always does." Mark watched me, his silence louder than any argument, and I waved him off. "Go home. I'll handle it." He hesitated, then grabbed his coat, pausing at the door. "Be careful, Cheryl. He's not the pushover you think he is." The door clicked shut behind him, and I stood there alone again, the house too quiet. I downed the rest of the wine, the buzz dulling the edges of my nerves, and started cleaning the glass from the floor. Halfway through, headlights swept across the living room window, Tom's car pulling into the drive. My heart lurched and I froze, the broom in my hand, as the engine cut off and his shadow moved toward the door. The headlights faded, leaving the living room dim again, and I stood there, the broom still in my hand. Glass crunching under my feet as Tom's key scraped in the lock. My pulse raced, but I forced my face into something calm, something soft, practiced innocence I'd worn 100 times before. The door swung open, and there he was, his coat damp from the night, his eyes locking onto mine like they could see straight through me. I dropped the broom, letting it clatter, and stepped forward, my voice lilting. "Tom, thank God you're back." I was worried. He didn't move, just stood there in the doorway, his silhouette cutting a sharp line against the porch light. "Worried," he echoed, flat, like the word tasted wrong. He stepped inside, shutting the door with a slow, deliberate thud, and I saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands flexed at his sides. "Where've you been?" I asked, tilting my head, keeping it light. "You just took off." I didn't know what to think. He ignored me, walking past, his boots tracking faint mud across the floor I'd just swept. I followed, my bare feet silent, my mind scrambling. He stopped at the kitchen counter, staring at the empty wine bottle, then turned to me, his face unreadable. "Karen says you were with her that weekend in July," he said, his voice steady, too steady. "Shopping trip, right?" My chest tightened, but I nodded, quick and eager. "Yeah, girls' weekend. I told you about it, don't you remember?" I smiled, stepping closer, resting a hand on his arm. "We hit the outlets, had some laughs." You were working late that whole week. His eyes flicked to my hand, then back to my face, and he pulled away, slow, like my touch burned. Funny, he said, reaching into his pocket. Karen couldn't remember which stores. Said she'd have to check her receipts. He pulled out his phone, tapping the screen, and my stomach sank as he held it up. A photo of Karen's car, timestamped that same weekend, parked at her sister's lake house 3 hours away. She wasn't shopping, Cheryl. And neither were you. My mouth went dry, but I laughed sharp and high. What, you're stalking her now? That's insane, Tom. She probably forgot. She's scatterbrained, you know that. He didn't laugh. Didn't even blink. I called her sister too, he said, pocketing the phone. You weren't there. So where were you? The air thickened, my lies tangling like weeds, and I scrambled to pull them apart. I was with Lisa then, I said, pivoting fast. I mixed it up. Karen bailed last minute, so Lisa and I went instead. He tilted his head, studying me, and I pressed on, my voice softening. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd overreact, just like this. You're blowing it out of proportion. For a moment he just watched me, his silence heavier than any shout. Then he stepped closer, his voice dropping. Lisa's in rehab, Cheryl. Has been since June. Try again. My breath caught, a jolt of panic spiking through me, but I forced my face steady, my eyes wide. What? No, she's out. I saw her last month. You must have heard wrong. He shook his head, a faint, bitter smile tugging at his lips. I called her Mom. She's still there. You're running out of stories. I stepped back, my heel crunching glass, the sting sharp but distant. You're unbelievable, I snapped, turning it on him. Checking up on everyone, digging into my life like I'm some criminal. What's wrong with you? He didn't flinch, just leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. What's wrong with me? He said, quiet cold. I trusted you. That's what's wrong. My hands trembled, but I clenched them, glaring at him. You're paranoid. I can't deal with this right now, I'm going to bed. I turned, storming toward the stairs, expecting him to follow, to beg me to talk. But he didn't. I heard the clink of keys instead, and I spun back just as he grabbed his jacket again. Where are you going? I demanded, my voice sharper than I meant. He paused, half out the door, and looked back at me, his eyes dead calm. To find out where you really were, he said, and then he was gone, the door slamming shut, leaving me staring at the empty space where he'd stood. The door slam echoed through the house, a hollow bang that lingered as I stood there, my bare feet stinging from the glass I'd stepped on, my hands shaking so hard I had to press them against my thighs. Tom was gone again, and this time it didn't feel like one of his sulky retreats. His words clung to me like damp cloth, to find out where you really were. Where did he think he'd go? Who did he think he'd ask? I forced a breath, deep and slow, and grabbed my phone from the counter, ignoring the smear of wine on my fingers as I dialed Mark. It rang twice before he picked up, his voice rough. What now? He's out there digging, I said, pacing the kitchen, the cold tiles grounding me even as my mind spun. He knows I wasn't with Karen or Lisa that weekend. He's checking everything. Mark cursed under his breath, a low hiss through the line. I told you to be careful, Cheryl. What did you say? I stopped, leaning against the sink, staring at my reflection in the dark window, wild eyes, flushed cheeks, a stranger's face. I lied. Said it was a mix-up. He's not buying it anymore. Silence stretched, then Mark's voice hardened. You need to stop him. If he talks to the wrong person. He won't, I cut in, sharper than I meant. I'll fix this. He'll come back, and I'll calm him down. Mark laughed, dry and humorless. You think he's still that guy? The one who just takes it? You humiliated him tonight, Cheryl. He's done playing dumb. I gripped the phone tighter, my nails digging into my palm. He's not done. He's just mad. I know him. But even as I said it, doubt gnawed at me, sharp and unfamiliar. Did I? I hung up, tossing the phone onto the counter, and ran my hands through my hair, tugging hard enough to feel it. The house felt too big, too quiet, every creak a taunt. I needed to think, to plan. I climbed the stairs, my legs heavy, and slipped into our bedroom, the bed still made from this morning, Tom's side crisp, mine a tangle of sheets. I sank onto it, pulling my knees up and tried to piece it together. That weekend in July. Mark and I at his cabin, the lake shimmering under the moon, his hands warm against my skin while Tom thought I was browsing outlet stores. I'd covered it so well, hadn't I? The receipts, the casual mentions, the lies I'd sprinkled like salt. My eyes drifted to the dresser, Tom's watch glinting there, and I remembered, he'd called me that Sunday asking how the trip was. I'd laughed, told him about a dress I didn't buy. while Mark whispered something in my ear. My stomach twisted now, the memory souring. Had he suspected then? I shook it off, standing to pace again, when my gaze caught on the closet door slightly ajar. Something peeked out. A corner of his old briefcase, the one he never used anymore. Curiosity tugged at me and I pulled it open, kneeling to drag the case out. The leather was scratched, heavy, and I popped the latches, my breath catching as papers spilled onto the floor. Bank statements, ours from months back. My name circled in red on withdrawals I didn't remember making, hundreds here, 1,000 there. A hotel receipt from July, the same weekend, tucked between the pages. My hands froze, the paper trembling as I read it. 2 nights, 1 room, paid in cash. I'd told Tom was for a car repair. He'd been collecting this, building something, and I hadn't seen it. My chest tightened, panic clawing up my throat, and I shoved it all back in, slamming the case shut. He hadn't just stumbled onto this tonight. He'd been watching, waiting. The doorbell rang again, shrill and sudden, and I jolted, nearly tripping as I stood. My phone buzzed. Mark. I'm outside. Let me in. But as I stumbled downstairs, my heart pounding, I glanced out the window and saw not Mark's car, but a sleek black sedan I didn't recognize idling in the drive. The bell rang again and a man's voice called through the door, low and unfamiliar. Mrs. Davis? We need to talk. The voice on the other side of the door sent a shiver down my spine, low and steady, cutting through the fog of my panic. Mrs. Davis? We need to talk. I froze halfway down the stairs, my hand gripping the railing so tight my knuckles whitened. The black sedan sat in the driveway, its engine purring softly, headlights off now but still ominous against the night. My phone buzzed in my hand. Mark's text glaring up at me. I'm outside. Let me in. But that wasn't Mark's car. I crept to the window, peering through the blinds, and saw a man in a dark coat standing on the porch, his face shadowed but his posture rigid, official. My throat closed. Who was this? The bell rang again, sharper this time, and I flinched, my mind racing. Tom couldn't have called the cops. Not this fast, not over messages and a hotel receipt. Could he? I smoothed my hair, wiped the sweat from my palms, and forced my voice steady as I cracked the door open, just enough to see him. Can I help you? I asked, tilting my head, playing confused. He was older, maybe 50, with gray streaking his temples and eyes that didn't waver. Cheryl Davis? He said, pulling a card from his pocket. I nodded slow and he handed it over. James Carter, private investigator. My stomach dropped but I kept my face blank, tucking the card into my sleeve. What's this about? I'm working for your husband, he said, his tone flat, professional. He hired me a month ago. Suspected some inconsistencies. A month ago. The words hit like a punch and I gripped the doorframe, my nails digging into the wood. Tom had been planning this, paying this stranger to shadow me while I laughed at his silence, his brooding. That's ridiculous, I said, forcing a laugh, light and dismissive. He's just paranoid. We had a fight tonight, probably overreacting. Carter didn't smile, just pulled out a notepad, flipping it open. Maybe. But I've got photos, Mrs. Davis. You and Mark Reynolds. Multiple occasions. My chest seized but I leaned forward, narrowing my eyes. Photos? Of what? Me having coffee with a friend? That's not a crime. He tilted his head, unfazed. Coffee doesn't usually happen at a cabin 2 hours away. Or in a hotel room at 3 a.m. My breath caught and I scrambled to pivot. You're stalking me. That's illegal. I'll call the police. He shrugged, pocketing the notepad. Go ahead. They'll see what I've seen. Tom's got enough to bury you in court. Court. The word landed heavy, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. Divorce, lawyers, everything I'd built slipping away. I slammed the door, my hands trembling as I locked it, and leaned against it, my heart pounding so loud I could barely think. My phone buzzed again. Mark, where are you? I'm around the block. I typed fast. Stay away. PI at the door. Tom hired him. I hit send, my fingers clumsy, and sank to the floor, the cold seeping through my jeans. A month. He'd been watching for a month, and I'd been blind, dancing around with Mark, tossing wine in Tom's face, thinking I held all the strings. How much did this Carter know? How much had Tom seen? I dragged myself up, stumbling to the kitchen, and grabbed a glass of water, the tap shaking in my grip. The briefcase upstairs flashed in my mind, those statements, that receipt. Evidence, all of it, and I'd left it sitting there. I bolted back up, my legs burning, and yanked the case open again, rifling through. More papers, gas station receipts, a toll booth ticket from that weekend, all circled in red. My hand shook as I tore them into pieces, the sound loud in the quiet, but then I stopped, a photo slipping out. Me and Mark, laughing by the lake, his arms slung over my shoulders. Clear as day. Not blurry, not deniable. The doorbell rang again and I jumped, the photo fluttering to the floor. Carter's voice came through, muffled but firm. "Mrs. Davis, I know you're in there. Open up, or I'll wait for Tom. He's on his way." My blood ran cold and I stared at the shredded papers, the damning picture, as headlights swept the window again, another car pulling in, Tom's this time, and I realized I was trapped. The headlights sliced through the blinds, painting jagged lines across the bedroom floor as Tom's car rolled to a stop beside the black sedan. My breath came in shallow gasps, the torn papers scattered around me like confetti from a ruined party, that photo of me and Mark staring up from the carpet, proof I couldn't rip apart. The doorbell chimed again, Carter's voice a dull thud through the walls. "Mrs. Davis, he's here. Let's not make this harder." I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaky, and shoved the briefcase back into the closet, kicking the photo under the bed. My mind screamed to run, hide, lie, but there was nowhere left to go. Footsteps crunched outside, 2 sets now, and I heard Tom's voice, low and clipped, talking to Carter. I darted to the bathroom, splashing water on my face, trying to wash away the panic etched into my skin. The mirror showed a stranger, pale, wild-eyed, lipstick smudged from hours ago. I forced a smile, practiced it twice, and headed downstairs, my heart hammering as the front door creaked open. Tom stepped in first, Carter behind him, and the air thickened, heavy with everything unsaid. "Tom," I started, my voice soft, pleading, "what's going on? Who is this guy?" I gestured at Carter, keeping my tone light, confused, like I hadn't just heard his title. Tom didn't answer, just shrugged off his coat, his movement slow, deliberate. Carter stayed by the door, arms crossed, watching me like a hawk. "Cheryl," Tom said finally, his voice calm, too calm, "sit down." I hesitated, then sank onto the couch, crossing my legs, smoothing my jeans. "You're scaring me," I said, letting my lip tremble. "Why are you doing this?" He didn't sit. He stood over me, hands in his pockets, and pulled out a small recorder, setting it on the coffee table. "Because I'm tired of guessing," he said, pressing play. My voice crackled through the speaker, "Can't wait." Tom's clueless. Followed by Mark's laugh, a call I thought was safe, private. My stomach lurched, but I leaned forward, scoffing. "That's nothing, Tom. We were joking, you're taking it out of context." He clicked it off, his eyes locking onto mine. "Context," he repeated, bitter. "Like the context of you and Mark at his cabin? Or the hotel? Or every lie you fed me for months?" I stood, matching his height, my voice rising. "You're spying on me now? Recording me? That's sick, Tom. You're the one breaking trust here." He didn't flinch, just nodded at Carter, who stepped forward, dropping a folder onto the table. Photos spilled out, me and Mark at the lake, in a diner booth, his hand on my back as we left that hotel. My throat tightened, but I shoved them away. "This is harassment. I'll sue you both." Carter smirked, just slightly. "Good luck with that, Mrs. Davis. Courts don't like liars." Tom cut in, his voice sharper now. "Enough, Cheryl. I saw you. That night at the bar, I came to surprise you, and there you were, tangled up with him in the corner. You didn't even notice me." My chest seized. He'd seen us? I scrambled, my words tumbling out. "You're wrong. It wasn't like that, I was drunk, he was helping me." "You're twisting it." He shook his head, slow, pained. "I watched you kiss him. I stood there, and you didn't even look up." The room spun, my lies collapsing under the weight of his certainty, and I sank back onto the couch, my hands trembling. "Tom, please," I whispered, reaching for him, but he stepped back, his face hardening. "I'm filing tomorrow," he said, quiet, final. "Carter's got everything, bank records, receipts, witnesses." "You're done." I lunged forward, grabbing his arm. "You can't do this, we can fix it." "I'll stop, I swear." He pulled free, his eyes cold. "You don't get it. I don't want to fix it. I want out." He turned to leave, Carter following, but I stumbled after them, desperation clawing at me. "Tom, wait." The door opened and headlights flashed again, Mark's car screeching into the drive, his silhouette leaping out, rushing toward us. "Cheryl," he yelled, and Tom froze, his back stiffening as Mark barreled up the steps, his face flushed, wild. "What's happening?" Mark demanded, and I saw the glint in Tom's hand, a flash of metal I hadn't noticed before. The porch light caught the metal in Tom's hand, a pocket knife. small but gleaming, the blade half out as he turned to face Mark charging up the steps. My breath snagged, a scream lodging in my throat as Mark skidded to a stop, his eyes widening at the sight. "Whoa, Tom, what the hell?" he said, hands up, his voice rough with shock. I lunged forward, shoving myself between them, my hands shaking as I grabbed Tom's wrist. "Stop it! Put that away!" I yelled, my voice cracking raw. He didn't move, his grip steady, his gaze locked on Mark over my shoulder, cold and unyielding. Carter stepped in, his hand on Tom's arm, calm but firm. "Easy, Tom. Not worth it." Tom's jaw twitched, and after a beat, he flicked the blade shut, pocketing it, but the tension didn't break, it hung there, thick and jagged. I spun to Mark, my chest heaving. "What are you doing here? I told you to stay away." He ignored me, stepping closer, his eyes on Tom. "You're scaring her, man. Back off." Tom laughed, a short, bitter sound that made my skin prickle. "Scaring her? That's rich coming from you." I pushed Mark back, my hands on his chest, desperation flooding me. "Go, Mark. Now." But he didn't budge, his face darkening as he glared at Tom. "What's this? You hire some guy to follow us?" He nodded at Carter, who stood silent, watching. "You're pathetic." Tom stepped forward, closing the gap I'd made, his voice low, dangerous. "Pathetic sneaking around with my wife. You think I wouldn't find out?" Mark smirked, cocky despite the edge in the air. "She chose me, Tom. Deal with it." The words hit like a spark to dry grass, and Tom lunged, shoving Mark hard against the railing. I screamed stop, as they grappled, fists swinging, grunts echoing off the house. Carter grabbed Tom, pulling him back, while I yanked at Mark, my nails digging into his arm. "Enough!" I shouted, my voice shrill, tearing through the night. They broke apart, panting, Tom's lip bleeding, Mark's cheek red where a punch had landed. The neighbors' lights flicked on, curtains twitching, and I felt the weight of eyes on us, my perfect life cracking open for all to see. "Get out," Tom said, wiping his mouth, his voice steady again, aimed at Mark. "Both of you." I turned to him, pleading. "Tom, let's talk, just us. Please." He shook his head, stepping back inside, Carter at his side. "No more talking, Cheryl. I'm done." The door slammed, the lock clicking, leaving me on the porch with Mark, the cold biting at my skin. He grabbed my arm, pulling me toward his car. "Come on. We're leaving." I yanked free, my voice trembling. "No. I'm not going anywhere with you. This is your fault." He stared at me, hurt flashing across his face, then hardening. "My fault? You wanted this, Cheryl. You begged for it." I stepped back, the truth of it stinging, but I couldn't face it, not now. "Just go," I whispered, and he hesitated, then climbed into his car, the engine roaring as he peeled out, tires squealing against the pavement. I sank onto the steps, my hands in my hair, the night pressing in around me. The door behind me stayed shut, Tom's shadow moving inside, and I realized he meant it, he was done. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out, expecting Mark, but it was Karen. Tom called me again. I told him about the cabin. "I'm sorry." My stomach plummeted, the betrayal sharp and sudden. She caved, spilled it all, and now Tom had everything, every secret I buried. I stood, my legs unsteady, and pounded on the door, shouting his name, but it didn't open. Headlights swept the street again, not Mark's car, but a police cruiser pulling up slow, 2 officers stepping out, their radios crackling. One approached, his voice firm. "Mrs. Davis? We got a call about a disturbance." I froze, my mouth dry, as the second officer knocked on the door, and Tom opened it, his face calm, composed, like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. The police cruiser's red and blue lights pulsed against the house, casting eerie shadows as the officer's boots crunched up the walkway. I stood on the porch, my arms wrapped tight around myself, the cold seeping through my thin sweater as Tom opened the door to the second officer. His face was a mask, calm, collected, the bleeding lip wiped clean, like the fight with Mark had never happened. "Evening, officers," he said, his voice steady, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He'd called them. He planned this. "Mrs. Davis," the first officer said, turning to me, his flashlight flicking briefly across my face. "We got a report of a disturbance. Care to explain?" I forced my lips into a shaky smile, brushing hair from my eyes. "It's just a misunderstanding," I said, my voice higher than I meant. "A little argument, nothing serious. My husband's upset, that's all." The officer raised an eyebrow, glancing at Tom, who leaned against the doorframe, silent, letting me flounder. "That true, Mr. Davis?" the second officer asked, stepping closer, his radio crackling with static. Tom nodded, slow, deliberate. "Yeah, an argument. But it's more than that." He reached into his pocket, pulling out the folder Carter had left, the photo spilling onto the table just inside. She's been having an affair. I've got proof, months of it. Tonight got loud because her friend showed up. My stomach twisted, while rising as the officer peered at the photos, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. This him? He asked, nodding toward the street where Mark's car had screeched away. Tom's jaw tightened. Yeah. Mark Reynolds. He started the fight. I stepped forward, my hands up, desperation clawing at me. That's not true. Tom pulled a knife. He's the one who escalated it. The officers exchanged a look, and the first one turned to me, his voice firm. You saying he threatened someone? I hesitated, the lie teetering on my tongue, but Tom cut in, calm as ever. It's a pocket knife. Self-defense, he came at me first. Carter saw it. Carter, still lingering by the sedan, nodded when the officer glanced his way, and I felt the ground slip further beneath me. All right, the second officer said, scribbling in his notebook. We'll need statements. Anyone hurt? Tom touched his lip, shrugging. Just this. I'm fine. I shook my head, frantic. No one's hurt, it's over. Can't you just leave? But they didn't. The first officer stepped closer, his tone shifting. We also got a call about possible fraud. Withdrawals from a joint account, Mr. Davis says you've been siphoning money. My breath stopped, the bank statements flashing in my mind, the cash I'd funneled for those weekends with Mark. That's a lie. I snapped, glaring at Tom. It's our money, I didn't steal anything. Tom met my gaze unflinching. Thousands, officers. Unexplained. I've got records upstairs. The second officer nodded. We'll need to see those. Mind if we come in? Tom stepped aside, gesturing them in, and I lunged forward, blocking the door. No. You can't, he's making this up. The first officer put a hand on my shoulder, gentle but firm. Ma'am, step back. We're just sorting this out. I stumbled aside, my chest heaving as they followed Tom inside, the folder in his hand like a weapon he'd honed for months. I sank onto the porch steps, my head in my hands, the night spinning around me. Fraud? He was turning this into a crime, painting me as the villain when all I'd done was chase something alive, something Tom couldn't give me. My phone buzzed. Mark? Cops there? What's happening? I typed back, my fingers numb. Tom's ruining me. Stay away. The reply came fast. I'm not leaving you like this. I stared at it, torn, when the door opened again, Tom emerging with the officers, a stack of papers in their hands. Mrs. Davis, the first officer said, his voice clipped, we're taking these for review. You'll need to come to the station tomorrow, both of you. This could get messy. I stood, my legs trembling, and Tom looked at me, his eyes empty. Sleep somewhere else tonight, he said, quiet, final. I'm changing the locks. Before I could answer, a car horn blared, Mark, back, pulling up to the curb, his face pale as he leaned out the window, yelling my name. Mark's horn blared again, a jagged sound slicing through the night as he leaned out his car window, his voice hoarse. Cheryl, get in. Let's go. The officers turned, their hands resting casually near their belts, watching as I stood frozen on the porch steps, Tom's words, I'm changing the locks, still ringing in my ears. The house loomed behind me, its windows dark, a fortress I'd been exiled from, and I felt the weight of it all crashing down, my lies, my choices, my life unraveling in front of strangers. Ma'am, the first officer said, nodding toward Mark, that him again? I nodded, mute, my throat too tight to speak. Tom stepped forward, his voice cutting through the haze. Officers, that's Mark Reynolds. The one in the photos. He assaulted me tonight. Mark climbed out of the car, slamming the door, his face flushed with fury. Assaulted you? You pulled a damn knife. The second officer moved toward him, hand raised. Sir, stay by the vehicle. We're not doing this again. Mark ignored him, stalking closer, his eyes on me. Cheryl, you don't have to stay here with him. Come with me now. I glanced at Tom, his arms crossed, his face stone, then back at Mark, wild and desperate, and felt like I was teetering on a ledge. Mark, stop, I said, my voice trembling, stepping down to block his path. You're making it worse. He grabbed my wrist, his grip tight, urgent. Worse? He's got cops here, accusing you of fraud. He's trying to destroy you. I yanked free, my skin stinging, and snapped, and you're helping him. Just go. His jaw dropped, hurt flickering across his face, but the officer intervened, steering him back toward the car. Last warning, Mr. Reynolds. Leave or we're taking you in. Tom spoke up, calm, cold. Take him. He's a threat to me, to her, to himself. My head whipped around, disbelief surging. Tom, no he's not, but the first officer was already on his radio. calling it in, and I saw the shift in Mark's eyes, panic hardening into defiance. "You want me gone, Tom?" he yelled, shoving past the officer. "Fine, but I'm not leaving her with you." He lunged, not at Tom but at me, pulling me toward the car, and I stumbled, my feet catching on the curb as the officers shouted, drawing their tasers. Chaos erupted, Mark wrestling me toward the passenger door, the officers closing in, Tom watching from the porch like a statue. I twisted free, falling to my knees on the damp grass, my hands scraping the ground. "Stop it!" I screamed, my voice raw, tears burning my eyes. The officers grabbed Mark, pinning him against the car, cuffs clicking as he thrashed, cursing Tom, cursing me. "You did this, Cheryl," he yelled, his voice breaking. "You wanted this." The words hit hard, truth tangled in his rage, and I pressed my hands to my face, the cold earth seeping into my jeans. The cruiser's lights flared as they shoved Mark into the back, his shouts muffled through the glass. The first officer turned to me, kneeling beside me. "You okay, Mrs. Davis?" I nodded, numb, my breath hitching as I wiped my eyes. "Just, let him go. Please." He shook his head. "Can't. Assault, resisting, he's going downtown. You should come too, give your statement." I glanced at Tom, still on the porch, his silence louder than Mark's outburst, and felt a hollow ache settle in my chest. "I'll come tomorrow," I muttered, standing, brushing dirt from my hands. The officers nodded, climbing into their car, and I watched them pull away, Mark's silhouette slumped in the back seat. Tom turned to go inside, but I called out, my voice shaky. "Tom, wait, I didn't mean for this." He paused, half in shadow, and looked back, his eyes empty. "You never do," he said, and shut the door, the lock clicking like a gunshot. I stood there alone in the driveway, the night pressing in, until my phone buzzed, Lisa's name on the screen, a text. "Heard about tonight." Tom called me too. I told him everything. "Sorry, Cher." My knees buckled, and I sank to the ground again, the weight of another betrayal crushing me. The driveway gravel bit into my knees as I sat there, Lisa's text glowing up at me like a knife through the dark. I told him everything. "Sorry, Cher." Everything. The words spun in my head, a carousel of moments I trusted her with, late-night calls about Mark, the thrill of sneaking off, the lies I'd laughed off as clever. My hand shook as I typed back, "What did you say?" "Call me," but the screen stayed silent, no dots, no reply. I dropped the phone into the dirt, my breath fogging in the cold, and stared at the house, Tom's house now, its locked door, a wall I couldn't breach. The cruiser's taillights had faded, taking Mark with them, his shouts still echoing in my ears. "You did this, Cheryl." I pressed my palms to my face, the damp earth smearing my skin, and felt the tears come, hot and useless. I'd built this, every glance with Mark, every jab at Tom, every glass of wine I'd tossed to keep the mask in place, and now it was rubble. I stood, my legs unsteady, and stumbled to my car, the keys jangling in my pocket. I couldn't stay here, not with the neighbors' lights still on, their whispers already weaving through the street. The engine sputtered to life, and I drove, no destination, just away, past the cul-de-sac, the park, the diner where Mark and I had lingered too long. My phone buzzed again, and I snatched it, hoping for Lisa, but it was Karen. "Tom's got a lawyer. Papers are ready. Thought you should know." My grip tightened, the wheel slick under my palms, and I pulled into a gas station lot, the neon sign buzzing overhead. A lawyer. Papers. Divorce wasn't just a threat now, it was real, inked, waiting to shred what was left of me. I banged my fist on the dashboard, a sob breaking free, and the clerk inside glanced out, his brow furrowing. I needed air. I climbed out, the night sharp against my skin, and paced the lot, my mind racing. Lisa's betrayal stung deepest. She'd been my confidant, my alibi, and now she'd sold me out. I dialed her, my fingers trembling, and it went straight to voicemail, her chipper greeting mocking me. "Lisa, it's me," I said, my voice cracking. "What did you tell him?" "Please call me back, I need to know." I hung up, leaning against the car, the metal cold through my sweater, and tried Mark next. It rang once, then cut off. Jail, probably, no calls allowed. I was alone, truly alone, for the first time in years. The clerk tapped on the window, gesturing at me, and I waved him off, climbing back in. I couldn't go to Mark's, cops might be there. Karen wouldn't take me, not after tonight. My parents were 3 states away, oblivious to all of this. I thought of the hotel, that same one from July, but the irony twisted my gut. Tom's receipts would have flagged it by now. I drove instead to a motel off the highway, its sign half-lit, the lot empty save for a rusted truck. The clerk barely looked up as I paid cash, my hands shaking, and handed me a key. The room smelled of stale smoke and bleach, the bed sagging as I sank onto it, my purse spilling onto the floor. I stared at the ceiling, cracks spidering across it like my life, and tried to piece together a plan. I could call Tom, beg, promise to change, but his face on the porch, that empty stare, told me it was too late. Mark might fight for me, but he was locked up, useless. I pulled out my phone again, scrolling through texts, when a new one popped up, an unknown number. Check your email. You'll want to see this. My pulse spiked, and I opened my inbox, a single message waiting, no subject, from an address I didn't know. It was a video link. I clicked it, my breath shallow, and the grainy footage loaded, me and Mark, tangled on his cabin porch, the lake glinting behind us, dated that July weekend. My voice, laughing, sang his name, clear as day. At the bottom, a note, courtesy of T. More where this came from. My phone slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor as the realization hit. Tom wasn't just leaving me. He was going to ruin me. The motel room's dim light flickered as the video looped on my phone, Mark's laugh crackling through the tinny speaker, my own voice cooing his name against the backdrop of that cursed lake. I stared at it, sprawled on the sagging bed, the cheap quilt scratching my arms, unable to look away. Courtesy of T. More where this came from. Tom's initials, his mark, like a brand burned into me. My hand shook as I paused it, the frozen frame, Mark's hand on my waist, my head tilted back, mocking every lie I'd spun. He'd filmed us. Somehow, somewhere, he'd caught it all. I bolted upright, my breath jagged, and paced the room, the carpet sticky under my feet. How? A camera at the cabin? A drone? Carter sneaking through the woods? My mind raced, paranoia clawing at me, every moment with Mark, every whispered thrill, now a weapon in Tom's hands. I grabbed my phone, my fingers hovering over his number, but what would I say? Stop this? I'm sorry? He'd laugh, or worse, say nothing, just like he'd done tonight. I threw the phone onto the bed instead, running my hands through my hair, tugging until it hurt. The walls felt closer, the air stale, and I stumbled to the window, cracking it open. The highway hummed outside, a distant roar, and I leaned my forehead against the glass, the cold a faint anchor. I'd lost everything: Tom, Mark, Lisa, Karen, the house, the life I'd curated like a perfect photo. And now this video, proof I couldn't deny, dangling over me like a guillotine. My phone buzzed again and I flinched, snatching it up. An email, same unknown sender. Tell me why I shouldn't send this to everyone you know. You've got 24 hours. My knees buckled and I sank to the floor, the device clattering beside me. 24 hours. Tom was toying with me, savoring this, making me beg. I pressed my hands to my face, tears stinging, but they wouldn't come, not fully, not yet. I needed a plan, a lifeline. I crawled to my purse, digging for my keys, my wallet, $40 left, a debit card tied to our joint account Tom had probably frozen by now. I thought of Mark, locked up, his reckless loyalty useless behind bars. Lisa wouldn't answer. Karen had picked her side. I was a ghost cut off from everyone who'd once mattered. The clock on the nightstand blinked, 2:47 a.m., its red glow taunting me. I grabbed my phone again, typing a reply to the email, my fingers clumsy. Tom, please. Let's talk. I'll do anything, just don't send it. I hit send, my chest tight, and waited, staring at the screen. No reply, just silence, and I wondered if it was even him, or Carter, or some lawyer he'd hired to twist the knife. I stood, pacing again, when a knock rattled the door, sharp and sudden. My heart leapt, hope and dread tangling. Tom? Mark somehow free? I peered through the peephole, my breath shallow, and saw a woman, mid-30s, blonde hair pulled back, her coat too neat for the stump. Mrs. Davis, she called, her voice clipped, professional. I cracked the door, wary. Who are you? She held up a badge, Ellen Hayes, attorney at law, and my stomach sank. I represent your husband, she said, her eyes cool, assessing. I've got papers for you. She handed me an envelope, thick and heavy, and I took it, my hands trembling. Div divorce papers, she said, crisp. Sign them, or this gets uglier. I stared at her, the envelope burning in my hands, and she stepped closer, her voice low. He's got more than just papers, Cheryl. Sign, or the video goes public, your job, your family, everyone. My throat closed and I clutched the packet, the weight of it crushing. He can't do this, I whispered, but she just shrugged. He can. And he will. You've got a day. She turned to leave, pausing. Oh, and Mark's out. Posted bail. Thought you'd want to know. Then she was gone, her heels clicking down the hall, leaving me clutching the end of my world. The divorce papers sat heavy in my hands, the envelope crinkling as I sank onto the motel bed, Ellen Hayes' heels still echoing in my head. Her words looped, relentless, sign, or the video goes public, and I tore it open, the pages spilling out like ashes. Tom's signature stared back, stark and final, next to lines demanding I agree to everything. The house, half the savings, no alimony. My eyes blurred, the ink swimming, and I clutched the sheets, the fabric rough against my palms. He wasn't just leaving, he was erasing me, stripping me bare with that cursed video as his trump card. The room spun, the walls too close, and I stumbled to the sink, splashing water on my face, the cold biting but not enough to wake me from this nightmare. Mark was out, she'd said he'd posted bail, and I grabbed my phone, dialing him, my hands shaking so bad I nearly dropped it. It rang, then his voice rasped through, thick with exhaustion. "Cheryl? You okay?" I laughed, a broken sound, and sank against the wall. "No, Mark. I'm not. Tom's got a video, us at the cabin. He's gonna send it everywhere unless I sign these papers." Silence stretched, then he cursed, low and fierce. "That bastard. Where are you?" "Motel off 95, I muttered, my voice small. "He locked me out. Cops took you. Everyone's turned on me." He exhaled hard. "I'm coming. Stay put." I nodded, though he couldn't see, and hung up, the phone slipping to the floor. I stared at the papers, the words blurring irreconcilable differences, and felt the irony twist in my gut. Differences? Like me unraveling our life for a rush with him, like Tom watching it all, silent, until he struck. I paced, the carpet threadbare under my feet, and tried to think. Signing meant losing everything, no home, no stability, just scraps and shame. Fighting meant that video hitting my boss, my parents, every friend I'd ever had, the whispers following me forever. I grabbed a pen from the nightstand, my hand hovering over the line, but I couldn't do it, not yet. I needed Mark, needed someone to tell me this wasn't the end. The clock blinked 4:12 a.m., each tick a hammer on my nerves, and I dug through my purse, finding a crumpled pack of cigarettes I'd forgotten about. I lit one, the smoke curling bitter in my lungs, and leaned against the window, watching the highway's lonely glow. Headlights swung into the lot, Mark's car rattling to a stop, and I stubbed out the cigarette, my pulse spiking as he climbed out, his jacket rumpled, his face shadowed. I opened the door, and he pulled me into his arms, tight, warm, the first solid thing I'd felt in hours. "You're freezing," he muttered, kicking the door shut, and I clung to him, my voice muffled against his chest. "He's ruining me, Mark. The video, he's got it all." He pulled back, his hands on my shoulders, eyes dark with fury. "He's bluffing. He won't send it, too messy for him too." I shook my head, shoving the papers at him. "He's not. His lawyer came, said it's my job, my family, everything, unless I sign by tomorrow." Mark skimmed the pages, his jaw tightening, and tossed them onto the bed. "Then we fight. Get a lawyer, hit back, fraud, harassment, something." I laughed again, hollow. "With what? He's got the money, the proof. I've got nothing." He grabbed my hands, squeezing. "You've got me. We'll figure it out, run if we have to. Start over." The idea hung there, tempting, insane, flee with him, leave it all, but I saw the cracks. No cash, no plan, just us scrambling while Tom went anyway. "He'd find us," I whispered, pulling free, sinking onto the bed. "He's too good at this." Mark knelt in front of me, his voice low, urgent. "Then we get dirt on him. He's not perfect, there's something. We just need time." I met his eyes, that stubborn fire I'd fallen for, and nodded, weak, grasping at straws. A knock rattled the door, sharp, and we froze. Mark stood, peering through the curtain, his face paling. "It's Carter," he hissed, and my heart stopped at the PI here, now. The knock came again, louder, and Carter's voice cut through. "Cheryl, open up. Tom sent me with a message." I gripped Mark's arm, my whisper frantic. "He knows you're here. What do we do?" Carter's knock echoed through the motel room, a steady thud that matched the pounding in my chest as I clung to Mark's arm, my nails digging into his sleeve. "Cheryl, open up," Carter called again, his voice calm, relentless. "Tom sent me with a message." Mark's eyes darted to mine, wild with urgency, and he whispered, "Don't. We can slip out the back. There's a window." I glanced at the bathroom, the chip frame barely wide enough, then back at the door, my mind a tangle of fear and defiance. "He'll just follow," I hissed, my voice breaking. "He always does." The knock turned to a pound, and I let go of Mark, my legs trembling as I stumbled forward, cracking the door just enough to see Carter's shadowed face, his coat dusted with early morning dew. "What does he want?" I snapped, my throat tight. Carter didn't flinch, just held up a manila envelope, smaller than the divorce papers but heavier somehow. "He said you'd want this before you decide," he replied, his tone flat, and slid it through the gap. I took it, my fingers brushing the cold paper, and he stepped back, nodding. "You've got till noon. He's waiting." Then he turned, disappearing into the gray dawn, his sedan rumbling to life and pulling away. Mark shut the door, locking it, and grabbed the envelope from me, tearing it open before I could stop him. Photos spilled onto the bed, more of us, not just the cabin but the diner, the hotel, even a shot from last month, me laughing in Mark's car outside his place. Underneath, a USB drive clattered out, and a note in Tom's tight scrawl, "Full footage. Sign or it's online by tonight." My knees gave and I sank beside the bed, the images blurring through tears I couldn't hold back anymore. "He's got everything," I whispered, my voice a ghost. "Every moment." Mark snatched the drive, his hands shaking as he jammed it into my phone, the screen lighting up with video, hours of us, stolen from angles I couldn't fathom, my voice, Mark's, our intimacy laid bare without a single explicit word, just the weight of it all. How he muttered, pacing, his face ashen. "Cameras? Bugs? He's insane." I hugged my knees, the truth sinking in. Tom hadn't just watched. He'd hunted, planned, turned my life into his evidence locker. "He saw it all," I said, numb. "That night at the bar, he wasn't lying. He's been building this." Mark stopped, kneeling beside me, his hands on my face, warm but trembling. "We can still run, Cheryl. Disappear, new names, new place. He can't own us." I looked at him, his desperate hope, and felt the hollow ache spread. "He already does," I murmured, pulling away. "My job's gone if this leaks. My family, God, my mom, she'll never look at me again." He grabbed the papers, shoving them at me. "Then sign. Let him have the house, the money, just get free." But I shook my head, the pen cold in my hand. "Free to what? This follows me. You don't get it." The clock blinked 6:03 a.m., hours ticking down, and I stood, pacing to the window, the highway a blur of headlights. Mark's voice softened behind me. "I love you, Cheryl. We messed up, but we've got each other." I turned, meeting his eyes, and saw the man I chased, the thrill that had cost me everything, and felt nothing. Love burned out, leaving ash. I don't," I said, quiet, final. "I don't have anything left." He flinched, stepping back, and I grabbed my purse, the papers, heading for the door. "Where are you going?" he called, his voice cracking. I paused, hand on the knob, and didn't look back. "To sign. To end it." I stepped into the dawn, the air biting, and drove to the station, the envelope beside me like a passenger. The officer took my statement, my signature scrawled in silence, and I left the papers with him, walking out into a world I didn't recognize. My phone buzzed. "Mark, don't do this. Please." I deleted it, tossed the device into a dumpster, and stood there, the wind howling, no home, no one, just the echo of a life I'd torched myself.